You'll note that the exhibition has an elusive title, which is purposeful. One of the things is to look at the late 19th century from a point of view different from that people mostly think about, namely Impressionism, and to tell another story about that. The darker side of light is therefore in part a kind of reference to Impressionism and what lies behind it. This exhibition is about the inside world. Most pointedly, it's about the world of thought rather than the world of sensory experience, which is how one tends to think about Impressionism. It's also about a lot of other things. One of those is the distinction between public and private, which became a very important issue in the 19th century in general. The apartments of Paris and the individual households of London became places of retreat. Take, for example, Albert Besnard's image titled Intimacy, which we see a woman and apparently a young boy seated in a living room by the fireplace. It appears as though she's reading to him. This is a picture of one of those interiors, one of those private places in the home where the sort of aesthetic experience that I have in mind was likely to have taken place. Curiously, the vision of thought that one finds most often expressed in works of this period tends to be carried out with images of women. The fact is that artists seem to have turned to the subject of women, including women themselves, in order to demonstrate, let's say, the state of interiority, states of reflection, of reverie, of meditation. Mary Cassatt, of course, does this. Käthe Kollwitz does it as well, but in a very different vein. Here we see a woman seated against a wall, possibly a peasant returning from market, possibly a servant. She has her wicker basket beside her, and she makes this extraordinary evocative gesture of placing her huge, well-worn hand across her face, partly blinding herself in a gesture that is opaque in a certain sense. But there's no doubt that this is an image about a human being and about the processes that go on beyond the surface in the life of a person. Among the most interesting figures in the artistic world of Paris in the 1850s, 60s, especially, was an etcher named Charles Meryon, who set sail with the Marine to the South Pacific, came back to Paris, and then began a very successful career as an etcher of Paris in its transformation, that is to say, Paris undergoing the urban renewal that was being carried out in those years, for which he must have had mixed feelings. And he selected from time to time architectural monuments in the city. He was a specialist in architecture for special attention, we might say. And his image of the Ministry of the Marine is a good example of that. Clearly this has some autobiographical resonance because, of course, he worked for the Ministry of the Marine. And what he shows here is the ministry being assaulted by a battalion of creatures, including some references to, for example, Polynesian war canoes that clearly came from his trip to the South Pacific. Fernand Knopf's beautiful drawing of a canal in Bruges is moody, misty, dark, very much like a dream. The care he's taken to capture the subtlety of the reflections in the water and the variations of tone on the surface of the building, the slight cold glow of yellow, the only accent of color looming in over the corner in the upper left. Throughout the 19th century, Bruges was a city that in the literature was constantly described in much the way that Thomas Mann characterizes Venice, as a city mummified, a city that retained the lost world of the Middle Ages, a city that represented decay. So Knopf's sense of mood here is also very definitely elegiac. Among the most interesting instances of an artist exploring the interior is a series of 10 etchings by the German artist Max Klinger, produced around 1880, in which he explores the subject of a fetish, in particular a woman's lost glove, which is picked up by a man and for whom it then becomes an object of obsession. The first he titles Place, which shows us the actual setting of a roller rink in Berlin at the time, with a group of well-dressed people standing around in social conversation. To the left, we can identify a portrait of the artist himself standing with an acquaintance. The moment is ruptured by a comic event, namely a young girl whose roller skates fly out from under her and she hits her bottom, and everyone's attention is suddenly shattered and turns to have a look at this comic break in the tension. And this initiates the narrative, which then proceeds as Klinger himself, as now artist, chief persona in the action, pursues the woman out onto the rink. We see her skating ahead with her dog, and she's dropped her glove. Klinger bends over, loses his hat, scoops up the glove, and the obsession begins. And now it becomes the story of a fetish. The next of them is titled Yearnings, and we see a young figure, not seemingly a self-portrait, bowed over head and hands as if mourning, the glove resting across his feet, and far in the distance, down at the bottom of the valley, we see a single figure who must be the lover who is now departed. Triumph shows a chariot, a pair of horses, drawing a curiously formed, shaped, clam-like figure that is actually in some way a transformation of the shape of the glove itself, and we can see the hand of it coming out, grasping the reins as the figures move forward, a reference to the classical triumph of Venus. One of the most fraught and intriguing of the images in the series, titled Anxieties, is a vision of the lover's nightmare, where we see a man coiled up against a wall, clearly in deeply disturbed sleep. The image of the icon of his attention, the glove itself, you can see pinned to the wall on the right-hand side, rather like a specimen. And then he's assaulted in his sleep by various manifestations of the glove itself, a gigantic one wrapping around above him and behind him pressing against the wall, a pair of them creeping in from the left-hand side behind a group of monstrous creatures who are invading his peace of mind. This then breaks to an image titled Repose, where we see again the image of the glove resting on a kind of bier, we might say, lying in state in a formal way, in a setting which is bounded by a curtain which you see behind, all made of suspended gloves, beneath which we see images of the id peeking underneath in the form of the snouts of hideous crocodiles. And finally, the dream comes to its end with an explosive image titled Abduction, in which a monstrous ancient creature, something like a pterodactyl, has grasped the glove and flies off to the right, hands reaching out of a broken window, parting around the mullions in an illogical fashion as the glove presumably disappears out of the protagonist's existence. Klinger brings the cycle to rest with a tragicomic image drawing on traditions of the Renaissance and antiquity, a little Cupid who has cast aside his quiver and arrows and his bow and turns around seeming to cry or mourn over the figure of the glove, which is now laid out in massive form. So Klinger has clearly made it as much a comical story as it is a mock tragic story. But what is interesting to me is to consider that this was a cycle that was conceived and completed in the early 1880s at a moment that was 20 years before Freud published his famous interpretation of dreams, which is to suggest that there were some remarkable things going on in the minds of artists that later became codified dimensions of modern psychology, yet they seem to be anticipated here.